Hello everyone, thank you for joining me. I'm Andrew Daley, and today I'm joined by Louise Baldwin, one of the founders of Archways. Louise, welcome, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to have the chance to speak.
So this is the second conversation I'm having with Louise. We previously explored our other research into how procurement can effectively buy software better moving forward with tools like AI. And with Archways being an AI native solution, Louise has very kindly joined me today to try and demystify some of the myths that we have around AI and simplify it for the non-technical mindset. So Louise, could you start by just giving me a sort of summary of what the Archways solution can offer procurement professionals?
Absolutely. So Archways acts as an intelligence layer for software buying. We essentially combine market intelligence, stakeholder input, as well as stack data to understand what software is in place to help procurement leaders better evaluate the right tools for organizational needs.
Okay, and you've got AI at the heart of the solution. What does that enable Archways to do differently in terms of speed up sourcing decisions or by specific data and preferences? What is it that what difference does AI truly make?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question because there's so much waffle in the space with AI and technical terms. But when it comes down to it, it's really about being more flexible to meet teams where they are and combining differences of intelligence to make the right decisions. So traditionally, when we look at sort of software purchasing tools, etc., they were quite static, they were quite flow based. And to be honest, often it involved bringing in external experts to give market perspective. You know, the Gartners, it could be the Accentures of the world, etc. What we're doing with Archways is taking that external market context, but putting it in the hands of the leaders that actually know the internal context, okay? The procurement leaders who actually know the process, the buying process, etc. So we're combining all of that market expert in outside intelligence with internal processes, stakeholder input, as well as taking the inventory of their existing software stack and combining that. Now, again, what difference does AI really make? With natural language models, it often means that there's just more flexibility to meet the procurement leader where they are in the process. So instead of saying, okay, well, I've been brought in at the contract stage and my job now is to negotiate the contract. I've no other context given to me other than this single document that I'm supposed to now go and renegotiate. We're giving them much more visibility into what the core business needs is, what the requirements are, what the alternatives are to the contract that they just received, so that they're given all of this core content to really level up the conversation and have a more strategic conversation about software procurement.
And for those people who are familiar with tools like ChatGPT and the like, where is it the same sort of technology that you're using, or is it subtly different?
Yeah, so there are aspects of sort of ChatGPT, like large language models, that often do play into our tool as well as many other procure tech tools. The difference is in the orchestration of those tools as well as the data that they're given to lean upon. So often these models, ChatGPT, as we all know, it's very broad. You know, you can ask it whatever you want, from advice on tools to where to go on holidays, for example.
Yeah.
The difference with dedicated tools is they are built with specific jobs to be done. They're leveraging additional data to inform that job to be done, which sort of redefines the process. So, you know, I think there's a lot of talk about agents or agentic flows, and that's really taking the underlying LLM models, but training for specific jobs. So enabling the agent to really become an expert to assist you in a job to be done. And that's really where you can sort of get a lot more value come into play than sort of the broader tools that are sort of set in a chat interface and are really just not as focused on the core job or more limited in sort of their data access and knowledge.
So you've got a sort of a corpus of specifically very, very relevant information, and then a tool which is, you know, sort of context prompting, context engineering on steroids in terms of, you know, the laser focus on the right information, the right process, and how it's delivered. Have I understood that correctly, or have I made a bit of a bad job?
Yeah, it's a nice framing of it. But I think as well, there's other aspects where it comes into play with the process flow and the UI. So, for example, we do have a part of our own platform that sort of operates in a natural language. You can go over and back in flow, but it also operates at many other layers. When we go to do matching, so basically when we take the rich context from users and then go to market and basically match and rank, so the models are coming into place there. When you're defining out your requirements or looking through our library of requirements, it's again using smart intelligence to basically do it in a more thoughtful way based on context. So part of it is the sort of raw structuring, etc. But the data and how that's put into a practical user flow, how that is surfaced for jobs to be done, is where there's a lot of differentiation and value add, etc. So, for example, you make a decision, right? You want to come back, you want to refine, you want to double check certain requirements, you want to pull in a stakeholder into that flow and get their approvals as part of the process. You want to add in case studies and you want to then generate a report and have a nice report that you can then share internally. So there's all of these additional pieces within the flow. AI is really just kind of the backbone that's pulling the pieces together in a more flexible flow for the job to be done, if that makes sense. Whereas when we look at traditional software, often it was just very process heavy. The tool was just incredibly flow based and there wasn't much flexibility within what problems could be solved or the speed at which they could be solved at.
So how is that helping teams evaluate their options faster without losing rigor or control? Because we talk about agents and human in the loop, and you hear those phrases a lot at events, and I'm sure we'll hear them next week at DPW. Just break that down for the non-technical mind, if you would do, Louise.
Yeah, so a lot of it is to do with the speed at which the checks are run, but the effort still has to go into defining what needs to be done, if that makes sense. So before this, you could spend time up front, you could align on requirements, you could rely on checks that need to be done, and then teams often launch into very manual processes to kind of get that job done. Where AI is typically adding a lot of value is the speed at which the right data can be checked and validated. So instead of doing it in days or hours, it's happening in minutes.
Right.
It still means, though, that the work has to be done defining what the needs are or what the process should be. So I'll use the example of in software, of course, you need to know your requirements are and the needs of the business, because AI won't answer that for you. AI is not going to necessarily know your context, but it can be an assistant in helping you better define that up front, in prompting you to say, okay, based on your context so far, these are typically requirements that we think should be run potentially, but do these make sense to you? What's missing? What makes sense for your organizational context? So, for example, starting with a blank spreadsheet, you now have an assistant that's working alongside you to basically help get the job done, but still relying on key stakeholder input. So I don't know, it is almost like having a very informed assistant, right? That still looks to your expert guidance, but is able to basically make the process much more efficient of getting there.
The way it's working out in my mind is it's equipping the procurement professional with all the right information and questions and criteria to then go and engage the business, to have the right conversations to really find alignment, and everyone's sort of pointing in the right direction. And then the tool can then go and execute based on that context you've given it, having got all the right information together with the business. Would that be a fairly accurate but simple way of putting it?
Yeah, I think that's a very, very nice way of framing it, right? Before, it was just so hard to kind of conversation, because I think you can be quite, you can feel quite exposed going into a conversation, asking these questions without context. And through sort of AI assistance, you're able to come in more informed. So to have, instead of a blank piece of paper, a starting point that's collaborative, that gets people talking, gives people something to react to, and that you can kind of refine the needs as you go. And I think that sort of that partner in doing so is what's really needed to have those conversations. Otherwise, it's very hard often to bridge the gap between procurement and IT, procurement and business stakeholders, etc. And so people go more into their silos. But having a tool that's there to partner and assist and help surface up requirements, etc., it often just, how to say, it's almost like having a central player who's helping coordinate among teams and reduce sort of sometimes the awkwardness out of asking basic questions, right? Sometimes it's hard when it comes individually and you feel like, oh, I am the one who has to dig in. I'm not sure if this is the right question to ask, etc. But if you have an assistant that's kind of helping support that process, making requirements more explicit, we find that it can really be a game changer for interaction among teams.
Exactly. So it's really an enabler of better engagement with all the key stakeholders, which I think is, when you look at what the fears that people have around the use of AI, replacing them is the classic sort of simple one, but actually it's changing the nature of the skills required, which we'll come to. But it's an enabler of better engagement with the business. And we had a previous conversation about, is procurement's way of buying software broken? Does it need to evolve as part of our wider research into that? And you gave some great insights that day. But if I look at some of the conversations I've had with software sales leaders from some of the traditional SaaS platform businesses, a lot of them have said to me, the real problem we see is with engagement with the business. There's the amount of part stakeholders involved, but they've not got all the stakeholders involved, and that can create blockages and delays in the traditional software sales cycle. But tools like Archways are an enabler, as I say, of better engagement with the business, which I think is a relief really for those that are worried that AI is going to threaten the jobs, but actually it can help them get better at it. So often I talk about augmented intelligence rather than artificial intelligence as being the way to think about tools like Archways. Would that be a valid point?
I love that framing. Like for us, the stakeholder input is absolutely essential. We don't think that for software procurement, you can just automate the process. And I will say, I don't think that's true necessarily of every procurement process, but it is absolutely true of software procurement because it's so strategic and so core to the business. So what we're emphasizing is trying to make stakeholder input easier to gather, easier to frame, so that you're having those more strategic conversations. Because if there's a category, in our bias view, if there's a category that is going to continue to be core to organizations, it is technology and software procurement. There is no more strategic category to lead because it is so essential and such a game changer. And so that is our view. And as you said, it's really about more augmenting, but keeping stakeholder and team and procurement input at the very, very heart of it. It's just enabling sort of the more strategic conversations because you're getting more data as input, you're getting more market intelligence as input.
And there's a really interesting conversation because if procurement were to use a tool like yours, they are effectively positioning themselves better to buy technology for the wider organisation. So they're buying AI to buy tech better. But procurement needs to be in the conversation about the wider organisation buying AI, doesn't it? Otherwise, it's going to get left behind and not be part of the wider transformation driven by AI tools. So we're sort of saying you should buy Archways to use AI to buy AI better. Is that the future that we're looking at?
I know it's always so odd. It's like software for software, AI for AI, but it is true, right? There's just so much noise in the market at the moment, and we want to be an enabler. AI tools are a core piece of what we evaluate, but we do boil it down to fundamentals, as in what is the tool being purchased for, what is it assisting with, for what need. But that is one of the core reasons that we see also procurement leaders embrace Archways, is that they're now able to have those conversations around bringing AI to business, around what's happening in the market and what tools should be looking at, etc. So I think our view, of course, is that it's incredibly important to be part of those conversations, right, and not take a back seat on it. To look more expansively, not just at what sort of jobs to be done or processes are being transformed by AI, but what that means in terms of where the new opportunities come off the back of that, because there are also so much more opportunity for increased value add.
Yeah, and that brings us nicely onto the question, which is one very close to my heart, and I wanted to ask you about the skills required, because there's one thing to use the AI effectively, and we can talk about, prompting and context and such like, but then there's the other thing of, okay, so it saves you all this time, it takes away a lot of what has historically been quite administrative, mundane and time-consuming tasks in the sourcing process, freeing up that time for procurement professionals to use it. So if you look at the pilots you've run, the proof of concepts you've run with your early customers, have you seen a shift yet in the skills required by procurement professionals to either use the tool more effectively or use the time that's freed up from that more effectively? Is that something you've seen yet?
Yeah, I think it really does need a bit of a mindset shift, or at least from those that we see sort of leading and embracing. Honestly, I think a lot of it does come back to curiosity. I know this is a point we've chatted on before, but I think having that experimentation mindset with tools is so important as you go through this process. Because before, often with tools, again, they were very sort of process driven. This is exactly what they did, and there wasn't much room for growth. Now with so many products, they're evolving quickly, they're expanding quickly. And that sort of experimentation mindset, I think, is key. I think off the back of it, the other thing that becomes more important with AI tool evaluation is commercial judgment, actually what the tools themselves don't have. So procurement leaders would always have this aspect, but it becomes even more important than before, because it's less so necessarily about the operational flow, but more about the judgment of, is that the right flow? How does this have commercial impact on the business, etc.? And so the focus on commercial judgment, I think, is just a key skill set that is going to continue to be so important as AI tools become more prevalent as a whole.
Yeah, if we look at the research we've done at the various events and using AI, of course, as well, we've sort of broken that down into 3 of the 7 skills of the future of AI and procurement. And the 3 that I'd highlight are sort of critical thinking, strategic thinking, and digital commercial acumen. So if you take the critical thinking first, this is a fascinating one, because to your point, to evaluate the output from the AI. And a lot of people sort of associate, AI literacy with the young people. So for my daughter just graduated this year, she thinks she knows AI better than her dad. Her dad thinks differently, right? But the people who've grown up with mobile phones in their hands and that Generation Z now coming to the workforce, they're more digitally and AI literate than people of my age, for example. However, the people of my generation are much more equipped with the skills and experience, or the experience, not the skills, the experience, to evaluate things much more effectively. That gives you those critical thinking capabilities. So for those people who are perhaps got a few years or a few miles on the clock like myself, actually they shouldn't be so fearful of AI, because their experience is vital to that critical thinking capability to evaluate the outputs from AI. I mean, that's something I feel very passionately about. I'm guessing you've seen that yourself already as well, have you?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when we look at sort of recent grads coming out, yeah, it's true, they've grown up with tech as their core. You see it now with, like kids in proms with iPads or whatnot. It's just how they've learned. But they haven't had the experience to do it the hard way, right? It's almost like, there's a reason why when we're in school, we still learned math, even though calculators existed. We still learned it because there's still core logic that goes into that and understanding. And it's much the same with sort of the practical experience of, so to speak, doing it the hard way. So, we see these sort of gaps you said, right? The younger generations have this benefit of they just grew up with it as part of their core, but the older generations have all the knowledge from the experience and the judgment that comes with it. So when you think about like bridging those two, I think it is leaning on the side of, if you can take that judgment, but experiment, see the results and critique it and correct it, right? Which many sort of younger generations won't necessarily be able to do as well. I think there's potentially a sort of a huge advantage in this, but it does involve sort of coming over that initial hurdle potentially of experimentation, of giving it a go, of sort of dedicating some time to play around with these tools, and then critique the tools when they inevitably don't have the full picture or misdirect.
Yeah, indeed. And I think there's been a lot of discussion recently. I was in a workshop last week at a big event about what is the entry point into a procurement career for a graduate or an apprentice now. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of other professions, because the historical tasks that may have been done to sort of, get some experience now are either automated or will be done by AI tools in the future. And also that fear that comes from the more experienced people who've always done a job a certain way. And so some of the more forward-thinking CPOs that I've been speaking to are talking about buddy systems where you've got the new person who needs all the benefit of the experience, and you've got the person who's a little bit stuck in their ways, maybe is a bit scared of change, but if you get them together, they could rub off on each other. You've got a win-win where you've got the young person, really encouraging them to experiment, and you've got the more experienced person sharing that experience and equipping the emerging talent with the capability to learn those critical thinking skills. So I think it's not an easy thing to do in a modern operating model, and we'll have to see how it works in a future operating model with agents. But I think there's definitely something in that about getting these people from different generations working together to bring the two positives from both sides. And then you've got other areas like strategic thinking, which I think is, again, something we normally associate with more experienced practitioners, that ability to think several steps ahead, particularly when processes are streamlined in the way that we expect they will be by AI tools and agents moving forward. But the digital commercial acumen, I think, and you touched on this before, with the commercial sort of, what was the word we used? Commercial judgment. That ability to understand, for example, if you're buying a new tool, whether it be a software for procurement or software for the organisation, to look at the impact it's going to have. And that's very, very, very difficult when you've not been through an implementation or adoption. So I think that's another skill that we'll see really. It's always been there in procurement, but I think it's going to become more and more important as organisations are sort of seduced by the next shiny thing from AI. Which ones do you buy? Which ones don't you buy? To understand the actual impact on the organisation on the bottom line, I think that's something which particularly leaders of procurement functions and other functions are going to need, that sort of commercial acumen to understand the impact of, whether it be AI or particularly data is the other one as well. I don't know if you've seen any examples of that. Maybe you recently worked with BT. I mean, I would imagine those guys, but they've really quite tried and tested about understanding the impact of the tools they buy, aren't they? Because they've got this history of experimentation in the digital garage. Have you seen much there from them or anybody else that you've been working with recently?
Yeah, BT are fantastic leaders in the space when it comes to experimentation, and sort of like an open-mindedness around it as well. They really have it in the core of their DNA. And I think that is one thing that, we've seen sort of teams successfully do. Like, part of it does come down to, of course, the individual. And you'll find that in every team, right? The innovators, those that are sort of spending their free time trying out new tools, bringing them into the team, bringing their colleagues along with them. But it is an organizational responsibility on teams and management leadership to do it themselves. And it's so inspiring when you see it in place, like Cyril and the BT Source team, because they have just made it intrinsic as part of their DNA, in terms of their mission in terms of the layout of their office, in terms of the projects that they put in place. And I think that sort of mindset adjustment really, really helps ensure that it's part of the culture. Which is so important, because if individuals feel like they're fighting against the tide in terms of innovation, it's just that much harder.
And they ran a competition where they had various different AI first businesses compete to win this new competition. Are you able to share anything about their evaluation criteria? So I think a lot of organisations are not sure how to get started on AI, worried about different solutions with agency, and you've got agentic chaos, I think is a phrase I've heard already from a few skeptical minds, shall we say. So how did they evaluate it, and what's your expectation in terms of how they'll bring it into the organisation alongside the other tools they use?
Yeah, so evaluating AI tools can be really difficult, but at the end of the day, AI is just the technology, it's just the implementation. It doesn't change the core of how software needs to be evaluated, in terms of what is the value proposition, what pain points is it solving, what does that mean in terms of the impact on teams, in terms of the impact on organizations. And so I think a lot of it with AI, you still have to just make sure that those fundamentals are in place. Now, when AI models are used, you of course need additional checks, right, to do with the data quality, to do with privacy and security. But those are one critical piece. It doesn't change the core in terms of needing to think primarily about what is the job to be done and what is the impact, irrespective of how the technology is deployed, if that makes sense. I know in our own case, kind of going through the competition with BT Sourced, and we were very lucky to win in the startup category. They really focused on impact for procurement more strategically. So, I think within this, we also had Louise speak at the start of the competition about kind of the future of procurement and where it's going. A lot of it is thinking more strategically about leveling up, right? There's this fantastic opportunity for procurement to become more strategic within organizations. It's not just about automating sort of processes that were in place. It's about ensuring that procurement is a strategic partner. And I think that was one core element in sort of the Archways proposition that resonated, right? Is that we're thinking more holistically for procurement. We want procurement to be a driver across different stakeholders and a collaborator within the business as part of this transformation.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example, that point I made earlier about digital commercial acumen. You think, well, what does that actually mean? But it's about understanding the impact of your investments. I think when you look at SaaS, there's lots of examples of businesses buying a tool and never really getting the true value from it, whether that be in procurement in isolation or for the bigger organisation. And I think that speaks to a lot of BT's experience of buying tools over the last few years, because they've been a leader in this field. And so understand the impact of it, and in this case, the value it delivers for the organisation. As a classic example, which I think a lot of procurement leaders need to start thinking that way. And it's been interesting to see how they can develop those skills other than through just experience, trial and error, and perhaps working with, across other departments to understand their experiences and broaden their own understanding. But I think that's a big thing for procurement leaders to develop moving forward. So finally, we're talking about trying to educate the procurement community on AI. Louise, apart from obviously investing in a solution like Archways would be a great starting point. But what's you've got one piece of advice perhaps for procurement leaders who want to get started with AI, not quite sure where's the best entry point? Have you got any experiences you can share that might help them?
Yeah, this is perhaps a basic one, but I would say find a colleague or a friend who is looking to experiment with you with new tools. It can be a lonely journey getting started, but you'll find that once you start asking around, checking with friends, so many are eager to get going and get started. But it's fun having a partner with you through the process. So whether it's looking at your team and thinking, okay, who in our team typically tends to be the innovator, the one that's sort of thinking about new tools or thinking ahead, or whether it's someone within your own personal network. But I do think it always sounds so basic, but I do think a large part of this is the experimentation, there's no defined starting point. It's finding the one that works for you, but not being afraid to get stuck in. And anything that reduces that friction and makes it more fun in terms of evaluating new tools can just be so valuable.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. So again, I referenced the workshop we did last week at a big event, and one of the big four consultancies was there, and of course they're all embracing AI because it's a big part of their future, of course. And one of them talked about that they've appointed AI ninjas within the organisation, and that's a full-time job to be like a pathway leader. I was going to use the word ambassadors then, because they've actually got AI ambassadors as well, and that's a part-time job. That's about the people who are really passionate about it, perhaps still want to do their normal job, if you will, but are embracing AI in everything they do. And so they'd be great collaboration partners for the sort of people that you're talking about. So I think forward-thinking organisations are starting to appoint, the evangelists who really embrace it, and then that can be a sort of a rallying point for everyone else who wants to get involved. So that's an idea that we heard last week from one of the big four that I won't name which one. That'd be naughty of me. There we go. So Louise, thank you so much for your time to share this, all this learning. I think some really fascinating things for people to think about AI as a broader landscape, also the particular area of focus for you with software evaluation, which is so important for procurement, buying software for itself, but hopefully for the wider organisation, particularly this AI era, which I think then positions it very well to embrace all the value. Anyone who wants to get in touch with you to learn more about the things we've spoken about or about Archways as a business, how can they get you?
Yeah, I'd love for anyone to reach out and drop me a note on LinkedIn, or you can reach me at louise@archways.ai, and I'd love to chat.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate it. Everyone, I hope you've enjoyed watching that. I hope you learned a great deal. If you want to learn more about the skills required for this era of AI and procurement, that's an area that I'm doing a lot of research on right now. You can, of course, get me on LinkedIn. Everyone knows I actually live on there. So you can get me there after you've got Louise, of course. But thank you, Louise. Really appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you at some events in the near future.
Thanks, Andrew.